standing here outside this store?
I'm waiting for my ride, officer. I'm not breaking any laws.
Then why won't you show me some identification?
Am I being detained or am I free to go?
Picture this. The sun is just starting to dip below the skyline of an affluent, quiet suburban downtown. The kind of neighborhood where the streetlights look like vintage gas lamps. The sidewalks are immaculately swept and the storefronts are a mix of high-end boutiques and artisanal coffee shops. It is quiet, almost too quiet. And standing on the corner of Elm and Maple, right outside a closed luxury watch retailer, is a man named Marcus. Marcus is a black man in his late 30s wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool suit that easily costs more than a standard used car. He is standing perfectly still. His hands are resting in his coat pockets. He is wearing dark aviator-style sunglasses despite the fading light, and he is staring straight ahead, unblinking, unmoving, just staring. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind, because what happens next over the course of the following 12 minutes is going to systematically dismantle everything you thought you knew about everyday police encounters, the fragile nature of our constitutional rights, and the dangerous, sometimes catastrophic power of a simple assumption. Let's shift our perspective to the driver's seat of a black and white patrol cruiser rolling slowly down the avenue. Behind the wheel is Officer Miller. Miller is not a rookie, but he is not exactly a seasoned veteran either. He has about 4 years on the force, just enough time to develop a strong belief in his own instincts, his cop intuition. Law enforcement officers are trained to look for anomalies, things that do not fit the baseline of a given environment. But here is the critical flaw in that training. When you rely entirely on a subjective baseline, your own personal biases and assumptions inevitably become the filter through which you view the world. Miller sees Marcus, a black man in a very wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood, standing frozen outside a closed jewelry store, staring into the glass. Miller's brain immediately flags this as suspicious. He does not see a man waiting for his ride. He does not see an American citizen peacefully existing in a public space. He sees a potential burglary suspect casing a joint. He sees a threat. Before Miller even steps out of his vehicle, we need to pause and talk about the law, specifically the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. In the landmark 1968 Supreme Court case of Terry v. Ohio, the court established a specific threshold for when police officers can detain someone on the street. To legally detain you, an officer cannot just rely on a hunch or a gut feeling. They must have what is called reasonable articulable suspicion. This means the officer must be able to point to specific, objective facts that suggest a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. Standing on a public sidewalk is not a crime. Looking toward a store window is not a crime. Existing in an expensive neighborhood is not a crime. But confirmation bias is a powerful, blinding force. When Officer Miller puts his cruiser in park and steps out onto the pavement, he is already operating under the assumption that Marcus is guilty of something. He just needs to figure out what it is. Miller approaches slowly, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. He closes the distance. Marcus, meanwhile, doesn't move. He doesn't turn his head. This is where the tension begins to spike. In standard police work, an officer expects a subject to acknowledge their presence. A look, a nod, a nervous shuffle. But Marcus gives him absolutely nothing. "Evening," Miller says, his voice projecting a false casualness that masks an underlying demand for compliance. Marcus tilts his head ever so slightly toward the sound of the voice, but his eyes, hidden behind the aviators, remain fixed straight ahead. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replies. His voice is calm, deep, and steady, too steady in Miller's mind. Miller takes another step closer, entering Marcus's personal space. "What brings you to this neck of the woods tonight?" Miller asks. Now let us be clear about what is happening here legally. At this exact moment, this is what the courts call a consensual encounter. Miller is free to ask questions, and Marcus is entirely free to ignore them and walk away. But, as we all know, the reality on the street rarely feels consensual when a badge and a gun are involved. Marcus responds simply, "I'm just waiting for my ride." It is a perfectly reasonable answer, but Miller's confirmation bias is already working overtime. He looks at Marcus, looks at the closed watch shop, and then looks back at Marcus. Waiting for a ride outside a closed store? Seems a little odd, don't you think? Miller is fishing. He is looking for a crack in the story, a sign of nervousness, a reason to escalate this consensual encounter into a lawful detention. Marcus doesn't take the bait. He doesn't get angry, but he also doesn't offer any unnecessary information. "It's a public sidewalk, officer. I'm not breaking any laws." This response, while completely accurate and legally sound, triggers something in Miller. It is what some experts call contempt of cop. Miller feels his authority is being challenged. And this is where the procedural errors begin to pile up, leading to a disastrous cascade of bad decisions. "Do you have some ID on you?" Miller asks, his tone dropping an octave, losing the friendly facade. Marcus remains still. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" he asks. This is the magic phrase. It forces the officer to legally define the nature of the interaction. Miller hesitates. He knows deep down he does not have reasonable, articulable suspicion of a specific crime. He just has a guy standing on a corner. But Miller's ego is now engaged. "I'm conducting an investigation," Miller says, sidestepping the direct question. "I need to know who you are and what you're doing here. You've been staring at this storefront for 10 minutes. Marcus finally turns his head slightly, facing the officer directly. The streetlights reflect off his dark lenses. "I'm not staring at anything, officer." Miller misinterprets this completely. He steps right into Marcus's direct line of sight, mere inches away. "Are you getting smart with me? You're staring a hole straight through me right now. I don't like your attitude. Let me ask you all watching this right now. Have you ever been in a situation where someone entirely misread your body language? Where no matter what you did, it was interpreted as aggressive? Imagine that happening with an armed police officer who has already decided you are a criminal. The tension is palpable. Miller is interpreting Marcus's completely fixed gaze as an alpha male challenge, a hostile stare down. He thinks Marcus is trying to intimidate him. He thinks Marcus is preparing to fight or flee. But here is the devastating reality that Miller is entirely blind to, largely because he never bothered to actually investigate before jumping to conclusions. Marcus is not staring at the officer. Marcus is not staring at the jewelry store. Marcus cannot see the officer. He cannot see the store. Marcus is completely 100% blind. 15 years ago, Marcus was a combat engineer deployed to the Kandahar province in Afghanistan. He was part of a route clearance patrol when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath his vehicle. The blast took the lives of 2 of his brothers in arms and completely destroyed Marcus's optic nerves. He spent 2 years in grueling rehabilitation at a VA hospital, learning to navigate the world in perpetual darkness. He is a decorated war hero. And through sheer grit and a brilliant mind for numbers, Marcus took his military disability back pay, invested it in a handful of emerging tech startups, and built a personal net worth of nearly $4 million. That bespoke Italian suit? He paid cash for it. He belongs in this neighborhood more than the officer patrolling it. But Miller doesn't know any of this because Miller didn't ask. He assumed. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Miller barks, his hand hovering over his handcuffs. "Give me your ID." Marcus, knowing his rights, shakes his head. "Officer, I have not committed a crime. In this state, there is no stop and identify law that compels me to provide identification unless you have reasonable suspicion that I am involved in criminal activity. Your hunch that I look out of place is not probable cause. Now please step back." The mention of legal terminology pushes Miller over the edge. He feels he is losing control of the scene. He decides to bypass the Fourth Amendment entirely. He reaches out and aggressively grabs Marcus's right arm to spin him around for a Terry frisk, a pat-down for weapons. Now, think about what happens when you suddenly, violently grab a combat veteran who cannot see you coming. Marcus's body reacts on pure, deeply ingrained survival instinct. He doesn't throw a punch, but he aggressively jerks his arm away and shifts his weight back into a defensive posture. It is a completely natural startled response for someone who has survived an explosion and lives in darkness. But to Officer Miller, this is the ultimate validation of his bias. "Stop resisting!" Miller screams, the cliché ringing out in the quiet street. He lunges forward, grabs Marcus by the lapels of his expensive suit, and slams him hard against the brick wall of the building. The physical impact is brutal. Marcus's sunglasses fly off his face, clattering onto the concrete. As he is pressed against the rough brick, struggling to maintain his balance in a world he cannot see, his hand slips from his coat pocket. A sleek, black, carbon fiber cylinder drops to the ground. It looks high-tech, maybe a tactical baton. Miller sees it drop, kicks it away, and yanks Marcus's hands behind his back, ratcheting the steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. "You're under arrest," Miller pants, his adrenaline peaking. "Resisting a lawful order, interfering with an investigation, and assaulting a police officer." Marcus does not scream, he does not curse, he takes a deep breath, fighting down the panic of being violently restrained in the dark. "My name is Marcus," he says, his voice strained but remarkably composed. "I am a disabled veteran. I am completely blind. That object you just kicked away is my folded mobility cane. You just assaulted a blind man for standing on the sidewalk." The words hang in the air. Time seems to stop. Miller looks down at the black cylinder he kicked away. It is not a weapon. It is a custom, carbon fiber folding cane, the kind used by visually impaired individuals who want something a bit more understated than the standard white and red stick. Miller then looks at Marcus's face, now devoid of the sunglasses. His eyes are severely scarred, fixed, and unmoving. The realization of what he has just done hits Miller like a physical blow to the stomach. The aggressive stare down was just the blank gaze of a man without sight. The resistance was the terrified flinch of an injured veteran grabbed in the dark. The suspicious loitering was a man waiting for a ride. But this is where we have to talk about the reality of the American justice system. In a movie, this is the part where the officer immediately uncuffs the hero, tearfully apologizes, and hands over his badge. But real life doesn't work that way. The machinery of an arrest, once set into motion, is incredibly difficult to stop. Miller is standing there, holding a handcuffed, wealthy, blind war veteran. His body camera is rolling. He cannot just say he made a mistake and walk away. He has already used force. He has already made the arrest. His brain frantically tries to justify the horrible procedural error. He conducts a search incident to arrest, pulling Marcus's wallet from his inner pocket. He opens it, hoping to find something, anything to validate his actions. Instead, he pulls out a sleek, heavy, metal black credit card and a United States Department of Veterans Affairs identification card. Right there on the front, clear as day, is a designation for severe visual impairment. A sleek black SUV pulls up to the curb. The doors fly open. Marcus's wife, a prominent civil rights attorney in the city, steps out. I want you to imagine the sheer terror and fury she feels seeing her husband, a man who gave his sight for his country, shoved against a brick wall in handcuffs by an officer who looks like a deer caught in the headlights. She doesn't scream wildly. She walks up, pulls out her phone, starts recording, and calmly asks for the officer's badge number and his supervisor to report to the scene immediately. The aftermath of this encounter is a masterclass in how procedural failures compound into massive legal liabilities. When the watch commander arrives, the situation is de-escalated and Marcus is uncuffed, but the damage is done. Now you might be thinking that the officer definitely got fired and went to jail, right? No, that is not how it usually works, and we have to be honest about that reality. Officer Miller is not immediately fired. He is placed on paid administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation. The police union releases a carefully worded statement saying the officer acted on perceived threats in a high-stress environment and asks the public not to rush to judgment. They attempt to invoke qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields government officials from being sued for discretionary actions unless they violated clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. But Marcus and his wife do not back down. They do not accept a quiet settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. They file a massive federal civil rights lawsuit alleging violations of the Fourth Amendment, unlawful detention, false arrest, and excessive force. They painstakingly break down the body camera footage frame by frame. They show that Miller never had reasonable articulable suspicion to initiate the Terry stop. They prove that the demand for ID was unlawful. They demonstrate that the use of force was predicated on a completely fabricated assumption. The legal battle drags on for 2 agonizing years. It is exhausting. The city's lawyers try to dig into Marcus's past, trying to find anything to discredit him, a common tactic used to exhaust plaintiffs into giving up. But Marcus's record is flawless. He is a patriot, a successful businessman, and a pillar of his community. Eventually, recognizing they are facing a catastrophic public relations nightmare and an unwinnable trial against a blind veteran, the city caves. They agree to a multi-million-dollar settlement, a fraction of Marcus's actual net worth, but a massive blow to the city's insurance premiums. More importantly, as part of the settlement, the police department is forced to rewrite their training protocols on Terry stops and interactions with disabled citizens, and Officer Miller quietly resigns, moving on to another department in a different county. There is no perfect, clean justice here. Marcus still has the trauma of being attacked in the dark. The city's taxpayers foot the bill for the settlement, and an officer who let his bias override his training is still out there with a badge. This story isn't just a dramatic tale. It is a vital anatomy of how rapidly constitutional rights can evaporate on a quiet suburban street. It shows how the Fourth Amendment is only as strong as the officer choosing to respect it in the moment. It highlights the profound danger of procedural ignorance combined with unchecked assumptions. Officer Miller didn't set out that night to assault a disabled veteran, but his belief that he could look at a person and intuitively know they were a criminal led him to bypass the procedural safeguards designed to protect citizens from government overreach. He skipped the investigation and went straight to the enforcement. When police officers are trained to see themselves as warriors in enemy territory, every civilian becomes a potential combatant, and every perfectly legal behavior becomes a suspicious act. This mindset inevitably leads to tragic, avoidable collisions. So I want to turn this over to you. As you sit there watching this, knowing your rights, thinking about how quickly an everyday moment can turn into a life-altering nightmare, I want you to ask yourself a question. If an officer's gut feeling is enough to override the Fourth Amendment, how safe are any of us, really? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video so more people understand their rights. And always remember to stay vigilant, stay informed, and watch out for one another out there.